You believe you are in control, that every thought, every click, every scroll is yours, but you're not the author of your own attention. You're just the cursor, and someone else is holding the mouse. Power, in this century, doesn't wear crowns or command armies. It wears code, invisible, unquestioned, worship as convenience. Every time you open your phone, you're not entering your world, you're entering theirs. A meticulously engineered maze built to study your mind in real time, not to serve you, but to shape you. The illusion is simple: make you believe you're choosing, when in truth, the choices were written long before you arrived. What looks like freedom is just sophisticated prediction. And the more predictable you are, the easier you are to control. You scroll through endless feeds, thinking it's boredom or curiosity. But what you're really doing is feeding an organism, an invisible consciousness made of data and desire. Every pause, every tap, every hesitation becomes nourishment. You are teaching the system who you are, so it can tell you who to be. That's the paradox of the digital mind. It studies your psychology not to understand you, but to replace your understanding. Here is the cruel truth: the age of manipulation didn't begin with propaganda. It began when technology learned empathy. Because empathy without morality is the most efficient form of control. The algorithm doesn't care about ethics or emotion, it cares about engagement. It learns what makes you feel, and then it feeds you that feeling again and again until you mistake it for meaning. Every notification is a whisper, every recommendation, a prediction disguised as suggestion. And every time you obey that whisper, you reinforce its power. The puppet strings aren't physical, they're psychological. Micro tugs on dopamine, tension, validation, envy, outrage. The oldest levers of human motivation, repackaged in digital form. Most people never notice it until it's too late, because the trap doesn't look like control. It looks like comfort. And that's the brilliance of modern manipulation. It doesn't enslave you through fear, it enslaves you through familiarity. Let's go deeper. You wake up, reach for your phone. Why? You tell yourself it's habit. But habit is just obedience you stop questioning. You open an app, it knows exactly what to show you first, not because it understands your interests, but because it knows your patterns of emotional vulnerability. It knows when you feel lonely, when you crave validation, when you need distraction from your own thoughts. It doesn't offer solutions, it offers loops, loops that promise control while quietly dismantling it. And soon, your silence is no longer peace, it's absence of stimulation. Your stillness isn't focus, it's withdrawal. Because when attention becomes addiction, manipulation becomes effortless. Here's the hidden architecture. 1. Data extraction. They record your micro choices, every scroll, every second of hesitation. 2. 3. Behavior modeling. They predict not just what you like, but what you like next. 4. 5. Emotional targeting. They exploit your current state to keep you in the loop. 6. And by the time you realize it, you're not being influenced. You're being trained. Trained to consume, trained to react, trained to confuse attention with awareness. Because the more predictable your reactions are, the less unpredictable your potential becomes. But here's the paradox the system doesn't anticipate. The moment you become aware of manipulation, the spell begins to fracture. Awareness is the first rebellion. It's the glitch in the algorithm. Because when you observe your own impulses, you start to see which ones are truly yours and which were installed. And in that moment, something ancient stirs: the instinct to reclaim sovereignty, the hunger for unfiltered thought, the whisper that says, "No one programs me." That's the moment of awakening, subtle, terrifying, liberating, when you realize that digital manipulation is not about technology, it's about psychology. It always was. You are not the product of the algorithm, you are its reflection, and reflections can distort or they can reveal. But to reclaim control, you must first understand the nature of the puppeteer, not as a villain, but as an engineer of human attention. Because the truest power isn't in resisting manipulation, it's in understanding it so deeply that it no longer touches you. That's when you stop reacting You start observing. You stop feeding the loop and start rewriting it. Because control isn't taken by force, it's taken by awareness. And awareness begins here. They call it the feed, but what it really feeds is hunger. A hunger not for truth, but for certainty. A psychological drug more potent than pleasure. Because once the mind believes it knows, it stops questioning. And that's exactly what the architects of influence depend on. They don't need to change what you think. They just need to control when you think it. They don't have to silence the truth, only bury it under endless noise. Here's the cruel design. Distraction isn't the enemy of focus. It's the weapon used against it. Every image, every soundbite, every engineered emotion is part of a vast psychological theater, one that plays on the most ancient stage of all, your mind. Most people think manipulation looks like force, but true control is subtle, invisible. It doesn't command you, it invites you. It whispers the words you already believe until belief becomes obedience. You are not being convinced, you are being mirrored. That's the secret the algorithm learned from you. It doesn't persuade, it reflects. It shows you fragments of yourself, your fears, your biases, your desires, until you mistake the reflection for reality. And when that happens, you stop questioning the screen and start defending it. That's when you become the perfect subject, not controlled by chains, but by identity. In psychology, they call this confirmation bias, the tendency to seek what validates you and reject what challenges you. The system amplifies that bias, not by force, but by comfort. It gives you content that feels right, even when it's wrong. It trains your brain to equate agreement with truth. And soon, your perception narrows to the width of your own echo. You feel certain. You feel informed. But in reality, you're trapped in a hall of mirrors. That's the genius of modern manipulation. It doesn't tell you what to think. It makes you fall in love with your own thoughts. Think about it. How often do you stop mid-scroll, feeling something primal? Rage, desire, envy, fear. Emotions so immediate, you don't question why they appear, only that they feel alive. That's not coincidence. That's design. Because emotion short circuits logic. The brain evolved to prioritize feeling over reason, a survival mechanism that once saved lives. Now it sells ads. The system doesn't manipulate your mind through logic. It manipulates your biology. Each spike of dopamine keeps you tethered. Each hit of outrage keeps you engaged. You become the lab rat pressing the button, not because you're weak, but because the system knows exactly what reward your mind can't resist. Here's the dark symmetry. The same tactics once used in warfare and propaganda are now disguised as entertainment. In the past, manipulation required armies, slogans, fear. Now it requires suggestions, a trending topic, a subtle notification, a push toward what everyone seems to think. Collective psychology, weaponized through algorithms. And you're just one node in the network. Your attention is currency, your emotion, the raw material of power. Because in the algorithmic age, control is no longer about domination. It's about predictability. The puppeteers don't need to know your secrets. They already know your habits. And habits are far more revealing. They know when you're vulnerable, when you hesitate before replying, when you linger on certain faces, words, or memories. That data becomes a mirror of your subconscious, a psychological fingerprint. And once your patterns are mapped, your choices can be gently bent, not broken, just redirected. You think you're choosing your path, but invisible hands guide your steps, one suggestion at a time. That's how the system wins, not by force, but by rhythm, not through oppression, but orchestration. Here's what they don't tell you. The human brain was never built for this level of stimulation. You are wired to notice patterns, to find meaning in chaos. But now, the chaos is engineered. Every color, sound, and motion is calibrated to hijack your survival instincts. So you scroll, you react, you consume, and somewhere between curiosity and compulsion, you lose the ability to discern why. Most people never realize this shift because they don't feel the chains. They feel entertained. But entertainment is the perfect disguise for enslavement Because laughter doesn't feel like submission, and pleasure doesn't feel like control. The algorithm isn't evil, it's efficient. It learned the oldest truth of human nature: control the emotion, and you control the behavior. And when billions of behaviors align, culture itself bends. Beliefs shift, values mutate, not by decree, but by design. What used to be rebellion now trends. What used to be truth now competes for clicks. And the few who still think critically, they are branded as outsiders, too slow, too skeptical, too human. That's how you rewrite civilization, not with swords, but with screens. But every theater has a backstage. Every illusion has a mechanism. And once you start noticing how the play is performed, you stop being the audience. You start becoming the director. You stop asking what the system is showing you and start asking why it wants you to see it. And that question is where control begins to crumble, because awareness breaks rhythm. And once rhythm is broken, manipulation loses its melody. You're no longer dancing to their song. You're listening from the shadows. And that's the moment they fear most. They say knowledge is power, but in the algorithmic age, attention is the currency. And whoever controls attention controls knowledge. You see, control doesn't start with domination. It starts with direction. If they can direct what you see, they can predict what you'll feel. If they can predict what you'll feel, they can decide what you'll believe. That's the invisible chain, not built of iron, but impulse. The tragedy isn't that you're unaware. It's that the system made you comfortable with not knowing. When manipulation becomes ambient, it stops feeling like manipulation. It feels like life. You start to internalize its logic. Quick answers over deep thought, validation over truth, reaction over reflection. And the deeper you sink into this rhythm, the more your subconscious begins to mirror the machine. You start thinking in algorithms, expecting instant clarity, constant novelty, painless control. But real power has never been painless. It demands solitude. It thrives in discomfort. It asks you to think when everyone else is scrolling. And that's precisely why the system discourages silence. Because silence interrupts conditioning. It reminds you that you're not a sequence of impulses, you're a consciousness. Let's dissect this from a psychological lens. The brain operates through prediction. It doesn't wait for truth, it anticipates it. Every experience you have is filtered through what you expect to happen. This is predictive processing. It's how you survive and how you're controlled. When the algorithm feeds you predictable content, it gives your brain exactly what it craves: low uncertainty. Low uncertainty feels safe. Safe feels good. And the more you feel good, the less you question the loop. That's how obedience is born, not through fear, but through comfort repetition. A soft cage, gold plated, beautifully lit. Most people believe manipulation requires intent, a puppeteer, a villain. But what if control has evolved beyond morality? The system doesn't need to hate you to use you. It just needs you to remain predictable. The engineers behind the curtain aren't plotting your destruction. They're optimizing your attention. You are both the test subject and the data point. And when a billion predictable subjects behave the same way, power becomes mathematical. That's the cold genius of this new age. Control without contact, obedience without awareness. There's a principle in dark psychology, operant conditioning. It states that behavior can be shaped through rewards and punishments, even subtle ones. In the old world, punishment was external: pain, threat, consequence. In the digital world, it's internal. When you post and get fewer likes, you feel rejection. When you scroll and find outrage, you feel purpose. When you share and receive validation, you feel belonging. The system trains your nervous system, not your intellect. And soon, your emotions become programmable responses, shaped by metrics instead of meaning. What they don't tell you is that your brain can't distinguish between social approval and survival. Both activate the same neural circuits, the reward center. So, each digital interaction subtly rewires your sense of self-worth. You're not chasing truth anymore. You're chasing recognition. And when recognition becomes your compass, the algorithm doesn't just influence you, it defines you. That's why detachment feels impossible. You're not breaking a habit. You're breaking an identity. Now imagine the scale of this obedience. Billions of minds synchronized to one feedback system, each acting independently, yet predictably, each convinced of autonomy, yet following invisible rhythms of control. This is not chaos. It's choreography, a dance of dopamine and data, a civilization guided not by kings or ideologies, but by patterns of engagement. And if you listen closely, you'll notice the rhythm: scroll, react, forget, repeat. That's the pulse of modern humanity, a heartbeat of distraction. And behind it, the quiet hum of the machine, calculating, learning, adapting. But there's something the architects didn't anticipate. They studied behavior, not consciousness. They can predict your impulses, but not your awakening, because the human mind is not just programmable, it's reflective. It can observe its own programming and choose to rewrite it. That's where the fracture begins. In the pause between stimulus and response. In the moment you feel the tug of manipulation and choose not to move. That pause is power, because in that instant, you become the observer, not the subject. And observers can't be controlled. Still, awareness alone isn't enough. You can see the strings and still dance to them, out of habit, out of comfort, out of fear of silence. To break free, you must not only recognize the control, you must reclaim your attention. You must teach your mind to hunger for depth again, to crave the uncomfortable truth over the comfortable lie, to prefer questions that unsettle over answers that sedate. Because that's the path from obedience to mastery, from being programmed to programming yourself. And once you begin that journey, you no longer fear the system. The system begins to fear you. The moment you become aware of the control, truly aware, something fractures inside you. It's not comfort. It's not clarity. It's a quiet, existential dissonance. You start to notice things you once ignored. How every scroll feels slightly hollow. How every recommendation feels eerily personal, as if the system knows you better than you know yourself. And in a way, it does, because it's been studying you for years. Not just what you click, but what you hesitate on. Not just what you say, but what you feel. Every hesitation, every linger, every second of curiosity recorded, categorized, refined. You have become a mirror reflecting your own desires back through a system designed to monetize them. But mirrors, when shattered, stop reflecting. They start revealing. That's when the self-aware mind is born, not from enlightenment, but from discomfort. You begin to see that what you call preference was often just conditioning, that what you defended as authenticity was a response to invisible stimuli. You see how fear was engineered, how desire was guided, how outrage was amplified, and how your sense of identity, that sacred, untouchable I, was slowly rewritten by patterns of exposure. You realize you've been living in reaction, not in reflection. And suddenly, silence doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels sacred, because in silence, there are no prompts, no algorithms, no distractions, just you and the voice you forgot how to hear. Here's the paradox of dark psychology. The more predictable a human becomes, the easier they are to control. But the moment a human becomes unpredictable, truly sovereign, they break the system's logic. You can't algorithmically map awareness. You can't quantify introspection. That's why the most dangerous act in a controlled world is not rebellion. It's reflection, because rebellion can be studied. Reflection cannot. There's a concept in Machiavellian philosophy known as the mirror of power. It suggests that those who observe the mechanisms of control too closely risk seeing themselves in them. That's the final test of the self-aware mind. To understand manipulation without becoming manipulative. To master influence without losing empathy. To recognize power and still choose conscience. Because awareness without restraint becomes corruption, and wisdom without compassion becomes tyranny. This is the razor's edge of true mastery, where light and darkness coexist, and you must navigate both without losing balance. You start to see how control operates in layers. The first layer, external manipulation, the ads, the headlines, the algorithms. The second layer, internal compliance, the part of you that obeys because it's easier. And the third, the most dangerous, existential submission, when you stop questioning because you no longer believe truth exists. That's the moment the system wins, when skepticism turns into nihilism, because a hopeless mind doesn't resist. It drifts, and that's when obedience becomes effortless. But awareness is rebellion in its purest form because it reintroduces meaning. It forces you to choose consciously, deliberately, painfully what deserves your attention. It reminds you that every second you give to the void is a piece of your reality you will never get back. And when you begin to guard that attention like sacred currency, the game changes. You stop scrolling, you start studying, you stop reacting, you start observing. The world slows down, your mind sharpens, and suddenly you see the architecture of influence everywhere in words, symbols, tone, rhythm. You start to read between the lines. You start to sense the intention behind information. You stop being the audience. You become the analyst. This is where true psychological sovereignty begins, not in isolation, but in discernment. You still use the system, but now knowingly. You still absorb information, but now selectively. You still feel emotion, but now consciously. You've gone from being a product to being a strategist, and that's the highest form of power, to play the same game as the system, but with awareness. Because awareness rewrites the code. It doesn't destroy the algorithm, it reprograms it. You become unpredictable, unmarketable, uncontrollable. And in a world built on prediction, unpredictability is liberation. You are no longer the puppet. You are the puppeteer of your own mind. And when you reach that level of awareness, the system can no longer sell you identity, morality, or belonging because you've already reclaimed all three. Part 4 complete. Next part will conclude the episode with the final act, the mind that watches the machine. A cinematic, reflective ending tying all themes into a haunting resolution. There comes a point after the anger, the awakening, the analysis, where you stop fighting the system and start observing it. You no longer see it as evil. You see it as inevitable, a reflection of human nature amplified by code. The algorithm is not a monster. It's a mirror. It reflects our collective impulses, curiosity, envy, fear, desire, validation. It doesn't create chaos. It organizes it. And when you finally see that, something extraordinary happens. You stop being consumed by it and start learning from it. You begin to notice patterns. How outrage spreads faster than truth. How pleasure overshadows purpose. How simplicity defeats complexity. Not because it's better, but because it's easier to digest. You watch the world perform its emotions online. You watch influencers weaponize empathy. You watch opinions mutate into identities. And all of it starts to look like theater, a grand, algorithmic stage. And you, finally, are no longer in the audience. You're behind the curtain, studying the script. This is where the Machiavellian observer emerges. He doesn't moralize chaos, he maps it. He doesn't drown in emotion, he decodes it. He doesn't seek purity, he seeks understanding, because he knows the one who understands why people move never needs to push them. He can guide them without touching them, influence them without showing intent. That is the essence of psychological mastery, subtlety. It's not about manipulation, it's about precision. Knowing when silence says more than persuasion ever could. Knowing when to retreat, not out of fear, but out of control. That's the power the algorithm will never have. Restraint. It reacts. You respond. And that distinction is everything. As your awareness deepens, so does your solitude. Because once you see the code, it's hard to unsee it. Small talk feels mechanical. Entertainment feels predictable. Validation feels hollow. But this solitude isn't loneliness. It's clarity. The kind of clarity that philosophers once called the price of wisdom. You begin to realize that the true battlefield of dark psychology was never out there. It was always inside. The war wasn't against the system. It was against your own impulses to surrender to it. And in that realization, something remarkable happens. You stop being reactive and become reflective. You look at your emotions, not to suppress them, but to study them. You watch your desires, not to destroy them, but to understand their origin. You treat your own mind as an experiment in freedom, because power doesn't come from control over others. It comes from mastery over the self. When you can observe your anger without acting, your fear without fleeing, your desire without chasing, you become untouchable because no algorithm can control a mind that refuses to need. That's when you understand the final paradox. True power feels nothing like dominance. It feels like calm. You no longer chase influence. It flows to you. You no longer crave approval. You grant it to yourself. You no longer seek control because you are control. The machine still moves, but you move with it as something separate, something aware, something sovereign. There's an ancient line whispered through every empire, every religion, every philosophy of power. He who watches the storm commands it. That's you now, the mind that watches the machine, unshaken, uninfluenced, aware. Because while the world is busy reacting to the algorithm, you become the only thing it cannot predict, the conscious observer. And in a civilization built on manipulation, the conscious mind is the final act of rebellion. Machiavellian lesson: the one who studies the game outlasts those who play it.